Hi there and welcome to this preview for my new soft pastel tutorial over on my Patreon channel. This tutorial focuses on this gorgeous wild stag, covering everything from the initial layers of pastels and how best to apply them, all the way to the final details and finishing touches. Students on my Patreon are encouraged to draw this artwork alongside me if they wish to. The tutorial comes with a full list of the specific soft pastel sticks and pencils used, and will also help to get you started with the accurate outlines on your paper. If you'd rather just watch and learn the methods and techniques, you're also more than welcome to do so. This tutorial is over 10 hours long, covering my full creative process for drawing realistic animal portraits. Please do enjoy this preview, and if you think the tutorial is something you may be interested in learning from, you can find the link to my Patreon in the description for this video. Many different colours and layers will be used to form this background, but it will be worth it. The background is a mixture of out of focus scenery with a few elements that come into focus. It creates a rich sense of depth and sets a powerful scene which I think will really aid in conveying the beauty of the stag. As always, I love to start with a mapping out stage to get everything organised. So here I'm using a dark brown and I'm just filling in all of the darker spots that I can see in this bokeh background. With bokeh comes soft transition, so between the dark brown I will use a lighter brown and then transition to some lighter yellows and oranges in the lighter spots. I'm always keeping in mind to keep a smooth gradual transition between the colours. Towards the bottom here, I'm also going to add in the Unison BE16, which is an orange with some peachy tones. This will also help to add the pinky undertones that I'm after. And close to the stag there are some darker patches, so I'm just going to lightly cover this with the dark brown Unison BE36. It may look a little messy at this stage, but don't worry, everything will start to come together when we blend everything out. Here I'm also lightly incorporating tones and mapping out some of the darker shapes with the warm brown Unison NE2. Now moving back to the other side, I'm going to continue with this darker area by filling the paper with Unison A38, which is quite a dark brown. You may be wondering why my colour choices are slightly darker than what you see in the reference photo. There are two main reasons. First is when blending out the pastel, the darker colours will lighten and the lighter colours will darken. You can think of the blending out process as slightly neutralising the values, bringing either end of the darker and lighter values closer to the middle. Because of this, I choose slightly darker colours than I can see. And reason number two is that I prefer to work from dark to light, so this whole dark section that you see here is just the initial dark layer, and you will soon see lighter colours get added on top after blending. As we move on to this larger area into the middle here, it's important to be patient. It's better to take your time and be slow and methodical to blend out the pastel rather than rush the process. If you rush and try to blend fast, or if you press down too hard, things will start to look patchy. Instead, opt to do smaller sections at a time like I'm doing here. So once this initial layer has been blended out, I can then take a step back, reevaluate the colours and values, and then choose other colours to put on top. In this area, for example, I think it could use darker orangey tones near the stag. For this, I'm going to lightly go over with the Schmieke 35H and then blend out again. The aim is to not push too much pastel into the subject area, but going over the boundary a little is fine. What you don't want to do is leave a gap between the background and the subject. We can simply erase the background that crosses into the subject area with a kneadable eraser. Using the corner of the ear here as a reference, and also this grass stalk here, I know that this sharper one kind of starts around here, I would say. Again, I don't need to spend too much time making sure the placements are absolutely perfect, because even if things are a little off, it will again make my artwork a bit more unique. But as I've said before as well, I do want to make sure that the stag is as accurate as possible, but I don't mind things such as the backgrounds being a little different compared to the reference photo. So as you can see, the Caran d'Ache goes on very nicely, even though there's quite a lot of pigment buildup on the paper. And I'll just draw in the shape that I see. So the very tip of this grass actually does go a little out of focus, so I'll very carefully, hardly any pressure with the sponge, just letting it glide over the top. Hopefully you can see that. If not, I'll zoom in. And I'm just lightly tapping where it goes a little bit dimmer in between some of these shapes. You can also tidy up with the sponge again. Kind of blends in with the pinky tones in the background as well. Again, just very light kind of dotted diagonal lines to make up the shape. And it's obviously, because it's blurry, it can be a bit thicker. Kind of curves over at the top as well, like this other grass shape. And sort of fades out towards the end as well. So just take a step back, see how that looks. Blend that out with my finger. It probably is a bit too pink compared to the reference photo, but I actually quite like the colour of it. Looks a little bit different. I can probably go back in with that Caran d'Ache, the light yellow one, and just very lightly again bring up some of the lighter areas that I can see, such as at the top here, maybe some coming down the middle. So these are currently the colours I have on my spare bit of paper so far. I might not use all of them, but it's always handy to have an extra few tones spare if you think they are needed. What I'm going to do is put a brand new sponge on my soft sponge tool just to give me a fresh start, and I'll probably start with the lighter colour, specifically this one, the cold grey blue at the top, just because with a new sponge head I want to take advantage that there's no other pigment on it so that it's not going to get muddy or dirty, and it's obviously easier to make things darker rather than lighter. So for that reason I'm going to start with the lighter tones and then work my way to the darker tones of the antler, and just carefully cut down into this antler. Now the handle and the distance from the paper of the sponge really allows me to see what's going on. It's obviously not going to be as vibrant as if I just went straight in with the pastel stick, but I just know that going straight in with the pastel stick is just going to cause problems of its own. I'm not sure about you, but I am quite clumsy when it comes to the placements of things, so going straight in with a pastel stick, I often find it hard to stay in between the lines, especially on details like this where it's crucial not to get it into the background. And as this black section comes into the reddy brown, it kind of transitions from a black to a dark brown. So I'll add that transition with the dark 5 unison. Just lightly go over both colours. Add in some of the A38. And then with my sponge, just add that in. And obviously this is because there's a lot of white or bright hair highlights here, so I want it to be a very soft application of pastel, not too much pigment at all, so that when I do come to add in those pencil details, it's going to be minimal chance for it to blend in with this darker background. But where you can see gaps in between the highlighted fur details on the reference photo, you will notice that the background for those gaps are quite dark. So I do need to get this dark background in, despite the whole area looking quite light with highlights. So this is how I do it with the transfer method, just because hardly any pigment goes on, especially when compared to putting the pigment directly on the paper with using the pastel sticks. This is a much gentler way. That means less mixing with the pencils and the base layer. So for soft pastel artworks, I would actually say that the blending out stage is probably my favourite part, just because all the hard work is done with plotting the various colours where they need to go. So you can just spend time and just methodically go through and push the pastel where it needs to go and just kind of get everything a bit more organised. And it's quite nice to see it come together from these rough colour placements and the grainy paper texture coming through to blending all of the colours and tones out and then seeing a softer appearance afterwards. I do find it quite rewarding. And then it's obviously quite exciting when you can get to the detail stage and see how much detail that you can incorporate into a particular area. I quite like the challenge. I'm not sure about you, but yeah, I think the blending out stage is probably my favourite part, other than the details, of course. And so to finish off this base layer, we just have these few sections of the face to finish. So I'm gonna first blend out the nose, and to do this I'm gonna use a disposable eyeshadow sponge, just because of the super small tip that they offer. It's really good for blending small intricate details such as this, and obviously with the smaller sponge head it allows me to see more of what's going on as well. So I think you can buy kind of like a pack of these or something similar very cheap off Amazon or eBay. Obviously you don't have to use these, you can stick to the soft sponge tool, but I do think they are very useful. They don't last as long as the normal sponge heads, but they are very good for small to reach areas such as this. So I think actually around here could probably use some pinks, and maybe where the lighter section meets the brown section, it's almost a pink hue on the reference photo, so just very light pressure going between the two. But I do like to add colour where necessarily, because it just, I think, elevates the artwork and just makes it more visually interesting. I think maybe even yellow as well would look probably quite good here, so I'll try with the Conte Paris. This is 047. It's quite a vibrant pencil, so I'm going to use hardly any pressure and just kind of make lines into this area just to lightly add the hue of this pencil. I can obviously combine as many different pencils as I want to get the exact colour or hue that I'm after. Probably won't need to use white here because that probably would be too overpowering. But I'm just going to now go over all the details where I can see the hairs are the brightest. Again, I'm paying attention as well to how many gaps I'm leaving in between, because the less gaps, the more dense the fur is, but the more gaps and the more you can see between the lines, the less dense the fur is. So always keep that in mind as well. So at the top of the ear here, I'm going to use the 680 from Pastels, the light peach colour, and just add some of these highlight reflections I can see for at the top of the ear. Because they are quite bright highlights, but they are quite peach in tone as well, so. On top of the orange lines already put in, I'm going to bring out some of the even lighter highlights with the Faber-Castell 132, and for even lighter highlights again, I'll use the opaque Caran d'Ache 68. I can see some hairs being very lightly reflected at the top of the head here, so I'm going to use the Caran d'Ache Pink White 581 to pick out these details. Only a medium pressure is needed here, as it is a very light pencil and this is quite a dark area. To ensure that the saturation levels remain high, I will go over some of the areas with this Brunswick light orange, as it's quite a vibrant colour. Now beginning to go on top with brighter highlights, I opt for the Durant 50 Saffron, which is a light yellow pencil. I'm carefully placing it in the areas where I can see the light hitting the most and making sure to follow the correct direction of flow. Continuing again with the Pastels 681, I'll press a little harder where I think some areas can be even brighter. As we come down the face, the highlights become slightly darker, so I opt for the more subtle Pastels 681. As the highlights become darker further down the face, they start to adopt more of a deeper pinky hue. For this, I'll use the Caran d'Ache 68, making sure to use a very light pressure so that the lines aren't too bold. To begin pulling out the highlights, I'll first start by using the cold grey Pastels 724. This pencil has quite a lot of blue tones, which is perfect for these shiny highlights. I'm focusing on where the light is hitting the most and using a sharp tip to place the pigment where it needs to be. I also have the benefit of pressure with pastel pencils, so I'll simply use less pressure for more subtle highlights or details and then I can use more pressure when I'd like a stronger sense of the highlight or detail. It can be quite confusing or difficult knowing what to draw and to make it look like a realistic nose, so instead I forget that I'm drawing a nose and I'm instead looking for the basic shapes and values that I can see in the reference photo. I can also stick with this cold grey to render these short, subtle hairs in this darker section here. Again, I'm not thinking too much about this being an actual stag nose, but rather what are the basic shapes that I need to draw in. I'm now just going to finish off the nose with some additional blue and purple tones, just very lightly going over the area with a sharp tip will allow just a little pigment to deposit without disturbing the details too much. I love to add in extra tones where necessary, as I find it really makes the outcome more visually interesting when you look closely and see more tones than first meets the eye. Okay, so now I can get around to working on the eye area, and like always with a new section, I'll first map out the flow direction of the hairs by drawing in the dark gaps with my black Carbothello pencil. This will help to get the area organised, and then I'll know what general lengths and directions to make the highlight pencil marks. I'm focusing these black lines mainly in the darker first sections just so that the contrast remains high. When there is a strong difference in value between the darkest base colours and the lightest highlight colours, it creates a strong realistic sense of depth. You'll see that I'm mainly drawing lots of small slightly angled black lines, and I'm sure to leave gaps in between. The highlight pencil marks will then be drawn into these gaps, and therefore these black lines will then turn into the dark gaps between the highlighted hairs. I'll now go over some of the areas I have already done to pull out some of the very brightest highlights with the Caran d'Ache Pink White 581. Again, I love this pencil because it's very bright but also has that slight pink undertone to the marks, which is perfect for these highlights. Using a light grey would probably look too dull, and using a white would be too unnatural. In this eye there are a lot of warm tones, and I can see some deep reds poking through, so I'm just going to go over very lightly with the Carbothello 640 to give a hint of those tones. With this warm pencil in hand, I'll also very lightly put a very thin layer of pigment down where the light reflections are going to be. This is because I can see some warm hints in this area too. This deep red pigment will slightly mix with the lighter colours that will go on top to give a hint of this tone. I'm also going in with the deep purple 770 and then the cold grey Faber-Castell 233. My aim is to create light thin layers that will combine to give me all of the subtle tones that I'm looking for. I love to pick out and see how many colours I can find in an area, and because pastels blend so well, it's easy to include them all. Okay, so now to work with the much lighter colours. Here I'm using the light cold grey Brunzeal 94. This light colour will lighten this area and include those light blue tones. I can then go over on top of all of this with the white Carbothello, pressing a little harder to whiten this area to make it look like a realistic eye reflection, and also to blend all of those previous layers and tones together. As you probably know by now, I love to keep the contrast high, so here I'm using the Cretacolor Black Chalk pencil, which is the darkest pencil that I own. I'm going over all of the darkest areas. I'll now go back and forth, refining the darkest and brown areas before moving on to the other eye. If you look carefully in the reflection, you'll see lines where the long eyelashes are also being reflected. To draw these in, I'm using a sharp Faber-Castell 175. This is a dark grey, not quite a black, as I think a black would be too dark for these fine details. As you can see, I've already basically mapped out where these highlights are to go on the base layer stage. You can see the layer of pastel is much lighter in the specific areas. Some of the paper is just slightly showing through. This lack of pastel here in the base layer will mean that the pencil details are able to go on top easily, leaving sharp, vibrant lines. If I placed too much dark pastel here in the base layering stage, this lighter pencil would have a hard time leaving sharp lines, and the marks would most likely look dull as it mixes with the dark pastel. Because the base layer is only very light where these pencil marks are going, you can see that the pencil can also leave its subtle red tone, which adds richness to the area. A lot of times when you draw pencils over layers that have too much pigment, the colour looks dull and has a hard time to show. This is why I say that it's so important to have light base layers in places where pencil details are destined to be. Other lighter pencils will be drawn on top of all of this in subsequent layers. This is more of a mapping out stage. I'm aiming to figure out the lengths and flow directions of these hairs before I commit to those lighter colours. Putting in this layer of subtle red tones also allows for more colour variation, which conveys a realistic sense of depth. Moving forward, I'll start to add more colourful and lighter colours. Here I'm going on top with the Bronzio Orange 24. This tone will complement the deep orangey browns that have previously been drawn in to give a sense of lighter highlights on top. Additional layers of highlights with the previous layer showing allows for a sense of depth. It's important to leave gaps so that you can see the previous layers of highlights and don't completely cover them. Here I'm also going in with the Caran d'Ache 745, and this lighter pinky colour will also complement the previous slightly darker red brown pencil layer. Hopefully you can see that not just any colour will work for the highlights, you need to keep it in the colour group. For example, as we lighten the Albany brown tones above, we get orange tones, so I use an orange colour pencil. For these pencil marks I'm drawing in here, I'm drawing on top of the red brown pencil marks. If we lighten that red brown colour, we'll start to get a pinky colour. If we go lighter again, we'll almost get a pink white. So in the near future, when I draw in the lightest highlights for this area, I will use the pink white colour. Another way to think about it is that oil painters will do the same, but just add a white to their colours to lighten it. The same principle applies to us soft pastel artists, but we have to actively choose the colours that are lighter but in the same colour group. I often see beginners just choosing a white or light grey pencils to highlight, and it will often look dull for this reason. Don't be afraid to use colours for your highlights, and make sure that your base layers are dark enough so that your highlights don't have to be too light in comparison. This is another factor to think about. When our base layers are too light, we try and make the highlights stand out more by choosing pencils that are too light. This will often weaken the saturation of your artwork. Instead, ensuring that the surrounding base layer is dark enough so that it automatically makes your less bright and more colourful highlights brighter in comparison. Here is a good visualization of this. The middle bar is the same shade of grey throughout, but relative to the darker or lighter colour surrounding it, our brain tricks us into thinking it looks brighter or darker than it actually is. The brighter surrounding colour makes the grey bar look dark, and the dark surrounding colour makes the grey bar look light. This is why when our base layers are too light, the highlights don't look bright enough in comparison, so we try to make up for it by choosing colours that are too light and contain little saturation. This next picture shows how the grey bar in the middle is the same colour throughout. It's only the surrounding gradient which makes it look darker or lighter in comparison. This is also why I make sure to add in those dark gaps throughout when I'm drawing fur, because I know if the surrounding colours around my highlights are darker, it will make the highlights pop off the paper even more. We don't have to choose the brightest colour for our highlights, but simply darken the surrounding area, which makes them automatically brighter in comparison. So to summarise the point, very bright highlight colours contain very little colour. These should only be used sparingly for the brightest highlights. Darker highlights on the other hand are able to contain more colour, which will increase the overall saturation in your artwork. Don't be afraid to use colours for your highlights instead of just greys and whites. The use of colour really goes a long way for the realism and making your artwork visually beautiful. If you think that your highlights aren't bright enough and that you need to use the brightest pencils that contain very little colour, it could just be that your base layer isn't dark enough in comparison. Now going back in with the Caran d'Ache 745 highlights, simply drawing the long hairs in the areas that I see the lightest highlights on the reference photo. Again, I'm making sure to follow the correct flow of the hairs, but I'm always adding in a little variation for a realistic outcome. Some hairs are flicking into slightly different directions, some are longer or shorter, some are lighter or thicker, etc. The last thing that I want to happen here is for all the hairs to look like a carbon copy of each other, as it would look very unnatural. Sticking with the aim of vibrancy, here I'm using the Conte Paris 18, which is a vibrant orange. You'll see how even though this pencil is very vibrant, it mixes well with the pigment that's already in this area. This will create realistic brown hair highlights as if the sun is reflecting off this area, just like as you see in the reference photo. And for the same effect, here I'm also using the Bruynzeel 42. Even though these pencils seem too vibrant for what we need them for, in fact, the extra vibrancy goes a long way, as the pigment will blend with the brown layers that are already there, weakening the colour slightly. This is why I use vibrant colours, to counter the weakening of the colours as the pencils mix with the base layer. If I was to use a non-vibrant highlight pencil here, it could look very dull and flat. I'm going to continue in this area just to build up these highlighted fur texture lines with various orange pencils. There's quite a lot of texture in this area, so it's just a matter of patiently spending the time to put in all of the pencil strokes. Remembering to constantly check the reference for the lengths and directions that these hairs are flowing in, and also what colour the highlights are, so if I need to use a darker or lighter colour. So I can now begin to put lighter colours on top and know that they'll be brighter and more saturated because most of that excess dark pigment has been lifted away. First I'm adding a layer of this light golden brown colour, and this is the Caran d'Ache 047. The element has patches with more pigment and patches where it's more blurry and the background almost looks like it's showing through. This is the blurry effect that we have to take into account. I'm going to now go over the lightest areas with the light pale yellow Caran d'Ache 541. This is a very opaque brand of pastel pencil, so I need to apply hardly any pressure, otherwise it would overwhelm the area. I simply want to gently lighten what's already there. Sticking with the highlighting, I'm going to use the slightly darker yellow Caran d'Ache 542 to pull out some of these lighter colours along the fern element. As this is a blurry element, the background can often look like it's showing through due to the out of focus effect. On the reference, the stag's fur almost appears to be showing through the darker blurry patches, so I'm going to re-add in some of the fur lines in these darker sections. Before I move on to the other fur elements, I'm just going to spend a bit of time adding some final touches to the stag's face. Here I'm taking a sharp white with a light pressure and just flicking some of those hairs out from the chin and nose area. Now I'll take a sharp black and pencil in those long black eyebrow hairs that come out from this section and flick out towards the ear. This is one of the more difficult details to draw in. As there is a lot of dark pastel underneath, it's important to apply more pressure, but we still want a nice sharp line. Pressing too hard will make the line too thick, so it's about finding the right balance. As you can see, I am adjusting my position to try and get the most comfortable angle for my hand and wrist to follow the curved line down. And then with a careful and steady hand, I draw a line from this point all the way down to the mark that I plotted at the bottom, attempting to follow a similar curve and shape as I can see on the reference. You may notice that my shape is a little different, and I did that intentionally. I prefer the shape of the long grass I am drawing compared to the one on the reference. You may choose to change your shapes too, or draw them in as close to the reference as you like, it's completely up to you. And then where you can see that lighter part sticking up, I'm going to draw some long grass elements by using the Caran d'Ache 542. These are just small basic lines that are side to side, angling down towards in the same direction. I noticed that the middle to lower section can still benefit from more saturation, so I'll lightly pencil in with the Durant Light Orange 090. And to finish off this grass element, I'll use the Caran d'Ache 542 and bring out some of the highlights a little more for the tip section. I hope this preview has given you a good insight into what you can expect for this 10-hour tutorial over on my Patreon. Just like in this preview, the tutorial is packed full of methods, techniques and tips to help you understand and create realistic soft pastel animal artworks. As well as this stag lesson, there are also many others to check out now. Head to the description for this video and click the link to my Patreon to begin learning. You may also want to check out the catalogue list of lessons on my website, which I'll also link below. Before you go, feel free to pick up this free soft pastel and pastel pencil beginner's guide. Thanks so much for watching here on YouTube, and I hope to see you in the next one.